So first, before I start, I just want to acknowledge all of you because today here, this is one of the largest Wilson's Disease Patient Association meetings in the history of these meetings, and I'd like us all to acknowledge Rhonda and Valentina and Tara and all the other people who worked so hard to put this meeting together. So And so you're all very special because you're contributing to this large meeting as well, and these gatherings are so important for moving the field forward and for communicating as a community. So I'd like to just mention disclosures, and part of the reason we put this up is that we work with a lot of corporate sponsors, but also because to give you an idea of just how much excitement there is around developing new treatments for Wilson disease. So there really are a lot of companies working on this, and I think it's important to acknowledge these partnerships because obviously moving this field forward comes not just from us, but also from these corporate sponsors that are working on new treatments for Wilson disease. So thank you to them too. And so, just briefly going over the year in review, we had a couple of AAV gene therapy trials. Vivette, as we mentioned, closed their trial, and Ultragenyx trial is ongoing with a phase 4 cohort dosed and completed. Alexion 1840 drug development was terminated by AstraZeneca, but was picked up by Monopar, and I want to acknowledge that as well. So that development is ongoing. And then Orphalon obviously is studying Cuvrior in the U.S. and trials to further understand the usefulness of that serum copper assay and to standardize initial treatments and potentially get FDA approval for Trientine for initial treatments of Wilson disease are contemplated. I also want to, while it's not a clinical trial, Eton did buy Galzin, the zinc drug, and they've been doing a wonderful job of rolling out access to that and increasing access, particularly for Medicare patients and people with high copays. So I want to acknowledge that. They are going through a specialty pharmacy, so for patients who aren't aware of that, their providers need to send scripts to those specialty pharmacies, that particular specialty pharmacy. And then obviously gene editing has been talked about earlier, which has some exciting trials coming in the future. So why are clinical trials important? And I think it's a good, this is a good point to start. This is kind of the charge of my talk, is to talk about clinical trials in general. And really they provide data for data-driven rather than anecdote-driven policy and recommendations. And we've seen how effective politicians from both parties have been in communicating with anecdotes. They'll say, Becky took the COVID vaccine and 10 days later she died. And so, and I don't mean to make a joke about that. I mean, it's an important anecdote. But then the question is the vaccine safe or not? And, Dr. Shilsky presented here data where he showed 2 people in his registry died early on in the COVID epidemic before vaccines were available. And he reported, no deaths after that, so from COVID. So this is kind of an interesting use of data and obviously to drive decisions people make. So these are kind of the things that data-driven decisions are useful. And clinical trials collect information, not just the registries collecting information, but clinical trials are collecting information and data on the safety and efficacy of drugs and how to better treat and monitor. They're also providing information on natural history of disease, what happens just as time goes by, and data again. And then they inform the FDA for approval of medications, insurance companies for coverage of medications, and patients and caregivers for, do I want to take this new medication, with the data that's available from the trials. So really, and it's an opportunity too, is for prescribers, educating us. Do we want to prescribe the drug, based on the data that's obtained in these clinical trials? What's the best choice for this individual patient of the available medications? And obviously, caretakers are also interested in this. What's the best thing for my partner or loved one in these treatments? So, clinical trials improve disease understanding, understanding treatments, and understanding prognosis that inform decisions. So, challenges for rare diseases exist, though. We'd all like to say there's kind of the lofty goal, like, I want my drug to be studied as thoroughly as a drug for hypertension or a drug for high cholesterol, and I want it to be know everything about it and its safety. But the challenge is that there are not large groups of patients to perform, a study of 200,000 Wilson's patients in a treatment outcome. And so this becomes the data is more limited. Costs increase. I mean, if you look at what Alexion did, they did a study across over 60 sites, throughout the world, and that to get a cohort of slightly over 100 patients in, in a treatment study. That's very expensive. So when you're asking for a corporate sponsor, FDA is asking a sponsor, hey, go ahead and collect a lot of data. That is not easy, and it's not inexpensive to get those studies together. Study times can be longer, too long. I mean, when you look at the timeline of development of tetrathiomolybdate, this has been going on for 3 decades or more. More than 3 decades. So these are some of the challenges that that we face, and obviously Wilson's patients would like to see if there is a beneficial drug, they'd like to have access to it. And then inclusion and exclusion criteria, that's how we define who goes in a study and who goes out, become harder when there's smaller groups of patients. And this is true of any rare disease. So, if we start excluding everyone from the trial, it becomes harder to enroll cohorts of patients. So these are some of the challenges that rare diseases face. Obviously, I've talked a bit about the sponsors of trials, but they play a key role. They're obviously doing some of the background work on treatments, developing these agents, working with regulators, and then paying for patients to actually be in the trials, because the trials cost money, and the insurance companies don't want to pay for clinical trials. They want someone else to do it. There's government funding, which is limited, let's put it that way. Currently, the government's closed, so it's even more limited when grants aren't being reviewed and so forth. But even before the government closed, there was a lot of limitations on trial funding. I want to acknowledge, for example, the development of zinc. When I started out in this research in Wilson disease, the development of zinc and the study of ammonium tetrathiomolybdate were largely government funded and investigator initiated. But a lot of those mechanisms have gone away over time or are more curtailed, and we don't have the clinical trial units we used to have through the NIH to study patients with Wilson disease and so forth. So those things have become more difficult. Plus, the regulatory burdens are higher now than they were 30, 40 years ago, and more expensive. And so that also creates a challenge for an investigator who wanted to do a trial without a corporate sponsor. So pharmaceutical partners are extremely important. And they really range in size. I sort of want to point this out too, because the Wilson disease community has heard about these changes. They're startups that are funded by seed money. So these are basically companies that don't have a lot of money coming in. They're basically funded on the promise that they get a drug approved and that they get are able to bill an insurance company down the road. And so these seed monies can be for periods of time, and then if the research shows progress, they get more money. So that's one example. And then there are larger pharmaceutical companies and medium-sized pharmaceutical companies that have revenue streams, but they also have internal shareholder accountability and accountability to their corporate governance structures and whatnot about keeping their costs under control and keeping their research moving forward as well. So, and there are issues like access to capital and so forth, borrowing, all those things impact the development of these medications. So, uh, I think that kind of summarizes what I'd like to say about the sponsorship of the trials, or how the nuts and bolts of them are put together. But now I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about phases of trials. There's generally four phases, and I'll just briefly go over those. The phase one is really safety. Is this, if it's never been given to a human before, how is it tolerated? And that's often done in healthy controls, where people are given a volunteer and are given a dose of medication that's never been consumed by a human before, and they study how safe it is. Then there's a phase two, which is a dose selection and safety, tolerability, and efficacy, which are the more preliminary studies. And so we've seen that published, for example, for Alexion 1840 years ago in the Lancet, was the promising phase two study. And then there's the phase three, which is safety, tolerability, and efficacy. And these are really what the FDA look for approval. Obviously, that's what we are often referred to as pivotal studies, because they kind of demonstrate, is this really a good idea for people to take this, and is it safe, and should it be approved? And then phase four is post-marketing. So, and those are particularly important for rare diseases, because how can you get more information on a rare disease and still try to cut down this long lead time to getting it approved? And that's to get it approved, but study it after it's on the market and collect more information and more data on its safety and efficacy. And so that's, and this is done for both rare and common diseases, but it's, I think, particularly important for rare diseases to keep looking at safety and efficacy even once the drug is approved. And so that's a way of trying to get closer to that goal of how do we find out more information without having 200,000 study volunteers. So a couple other points about data. Everyone wants to know, when is the data going to be available? When are we going to see it? And it's generally not rigorously aggregated until the data is locked at the end of a phase. So, oftentimes we're at different study sections. I see data on people I've enrolled, but I don't see data on people at other centers in quite the same way. And so, and the data isn't publicly presented oftentimes until data is more aggregated and locked. You might say, well, what if something is unsafe? Well, there's a data safety monitoring board, which is a separate group of doctors who review the data and look at it in an ongoing way to allow it to be approved. And then there's public coordination of data release, which often comes from sponsors, so not from individual investigators. So clinical trials, in summary, allow access to new therapies quicker. People who enroll in them can have a benefit. They provide financial support for treatment and monitoring and travel, often provide better than standard of care. If you look in aggregate, people in clinical trials often do better than people who don't go in clinical trials, but they also involve a time commitment, and there's potential for risk, because these studies may not have been as well studied. That's why there is a clinical study. We don't know as much about the treatment. So in summary, at the end, I'd just like to acknowledge, obviously, there are lots of people who participate in these studies: study coordinators, there are clinical trial monitors who come in and be sure the study is being conducted properly. There are sponsors who participate in these studies and often start them with input of experts like the folks in this room. There are patient advocates who play a big role in study design, and what do the patients want, communicating with sponsors and with healthcare providers, what actually is needed, what are the unmet needs. There's internal review, IRB reviews. These are, again, looking at, is the study a reasonable study, and so forth. There are clinical trial nurses, advanced practice providers, physicians, collaborators. Obviously, we work together around the world when we're doing many of these studies. And I want to acknowledge, obviously, the Wilson Disease Association's role, but most importantly, the patients, caregivers who participate in these trials, because obviously, without you participating, we wouldn't have this data to inform decisions going forward. So thank you, everyone, and appreciate the opportunity to talk.